having me, Paloma. Thank you for reaching out and extending the invitation. It's really exciting to be back at UT, and I was doing the math, and I think the last time I was at the UT campus was 2006 when I defended my dissertation. So this is like 20 years, almost to the month, because I defended, I think, in January. So 20 years ago, and it's very exciting to be back here. So I think we have about, I'm going to keep this about 30-40 minutes so that we have time for some discussion. Seth has kindly prepared some comments, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say, particularly given his area of research on Guaraná. There's this whole world of food and beverages out there that are being rapidly remade in the current kind of global space, if you will. The quote-unquote discovery of all of these indigenous products and foods and drinks, and I think there's a lot of us that are wondering what that means for the people that make them, the people that consume them, and the connection between those different groups of people. So my book came out in April in 2025. I also want to thank Casey from UT Press at the other end of the table, who was my editor through this process, and it's not very often that you get to have your editor in the room to thank and credit for helping bring this book into being. So I'm just ever grateful to UT Press for believing in this project. I am going to talk a little bit about, I think it's important to understand how I came to do this project. Adela was just asking me that, and I was sort of mentioning that my sister is the 6th generation of hop producers in Washington State, and as a child of the 1970s, I grew up around not beer per se, but I was beer adjacent as a child. I was probably the only kid in my elementary school that had a Spuds McKenzie T-shirt, if you remember those. They actually got banned. We were adjacent to that time the beer industry meant Anheuser-Busch, it meant Coors, it meant these big, large industrial brewers. And so I was talking to the folks up here saying that it wasn't until 15 years or 20 years ago that my sister, as the person that took over the farm, even started considering craft breweries as a potential market for the product that she was producing, right? So she would have said, oh, they're just whatever, drop in the bucket, who cares, craft brewers, yeah. And then she started to take it very seriously as it became the market, right? And a lot of, the production shifted, and she shifted actually what she grew because she tailored for the market. When I was a kid, our farm probably grew maybe 4 or 5 different varietals of hops, right? That, the standard ones that were from the Pacific Northwest that went into making Budweiser, et cetera, all those beers we now don't drink, right? Because they're not good. And, now, she's growing to, 15, 30 different varietals of beers that are, it's not unlike what happened with Mezcal, right? Some of the kind of the opening up of a new market, I see some parallels here. I'm not going to touch on it too much, but I think they're definitely there. How did I come to working on this particular topic? And I think, they always are asking you as an academic, especially when you're going up for promotion, to show the through line of your academic trajectory. And I think my through line is that, all of my research, if I had to say what is the uniting feature, is that I work on craft economies. That's really my main interest, is craft, and that's how I became interested in Mezcal. People always ask me, like, oh, you must love Mezcal, you must drink Mezcal. I don't, actually. I don't even remember the last time I tasted Mezcal. I mean, I don't sit at home just like, So, really I came to Mezcal not as a connoisseur of Mezcal, but rather somebody that was very fascinated with artisanal production in general. And I started out, my first book, which is my doctoral dissertation, I'm hoping we have anybody in here student? A few students right that are thinking about projects. I got started as an undergraduate, actually. I studied in Oaxaca in 1995, and I did an undergraduate honors thesis as an undergrad on craft production in Oaxaca. I was very interested in Oaxacan wood carving. I went there and I had the opportunity to see all these villages, and it was like something interesting is happening in Oaxaca where you have this incredible artisanal traditions that is very specialized, tied to specific communities, and now is sort of, there's this huge market. The 90s, right, was a time when Oaxacan wood carving kind of exploded, right? People started recognizing it's being sold all over the place. And so I started out looking at Oaxacan wood carving. I lived in a Oaxacan artisan for a year. I was a good anthropologist, spent a lot of time in the communities. And I should say, and I think to your point earlier, in the 90s, nobody drank mezcal, nobody taught. It was there. If you were in Oaxaca, there was mezcal around, but it was kind of just, it was there, right? There was no little bars where you just pop in for the mezcalito. There was no boutique selling it. It was not, it was kind of like this, side thing that was disparaged by upper class Oaxacans, upper class Mexicans. Chilangos, the somewhat pejorative term for people from Mexico City, were not drinking mezcal. So I knew it was there, and the times I had mezcal in the 90s was like, at some village wedding, right? I talk about being served out of a giant gasoline container. That was the context I had for mezcal. And then around 2010, 2011, I went to Oaxaca. I was invited to be part of a history seminar that Bill Beasley at the University of Arizona used to have every summer. And I went to this kind of restaurant that caters to tourists. And suddenly I noticed that they had this menu with pages and pages and pages of mezcal. And I was like, I hadn't seen that before. And what I didn't realize at the time was 2010 was the date that was considered the start of people talk about el boom, the mezcal boom, right? It's usually dated to around 2010. There's not one singular moment, but that's roughly the year, right? And so I was in Oaxaca, and I was starting to see evidence of this boom happening, right? At these restaurants, and people, what I'd never seen before, listings of different mezcals and the different types of agave. That was new. They would never have said this is a tepestate or this is an espadín, right? So they start distinguishing, even putting the names of producers, right? So providing more information about something that pretty much was just ignored before. So there was something happening, right? And I thought, this is something I need to capture, right? I'm living it in real time, and I want to see what's going on. This is I think this is a really telling image, because I think it sets the tone for a lot of what's happening in Oaxaca. This is from
Santo Domingo.
Yeah, this is Santo Domingo, which is one of the main churches in the downtown area. And this is a day where they were filming Mexico Top Chef. Anybody know Top Chef? Right? So they have the Mexico version of that. And this was a day they were filming, right? And so one of the things that happens in tandem with the mezcal boom is Oaxaca's transformation into a food destination, right? When I lived in Oaxaca in the early 90s, Oaxaca's world renowned for its food, but back then, with the exception of maybe Diana Kennedy, if you know her, nobody was talking about Oaxaca food. There was no Netflix specials, following around women that look like this in the markets and, watch, fetishizing them making a tortilla on a comal, right? They weren't doing that. But we see that there's this, not only the transformation of the mezcal industry, but I would say, and I do say it in the book, and I said it to Casey early on as my editor, I think this book is not really about mezcal, it's about Oaxaca. And he said, no, we're not putting that in the title. He's like, it's about mezcal. But really, I see the development of mezcal as parallel to Oaxaca's trajectory as a global destination, right? And its development of a certain set of characteristics as a place. I'm in a geography department now, so I pay much more attention to place and space than I ever did before. But this is this kind of transformation as into a foodie place, right? To use the popular term foodie, is part of the evolution of mezcal. Without the growth of foodie culture and the transformation of Oaxaca into a certain kind of place, right? Those things are mutually reinforcing, right? So I think that we always have to keep that in mind, that the place itself is evolving and is along the same kind of path that Mezcal has evolved. Okay, I'm gonna speed up here. So going back a little bit, I said when I started doing my research back in the 90s, Mezcal was, it was something that people drank locally. This picture up here with the blue wall, that's actually a picture from my dissertation field work back in the day. If you went to, a baptism, a confirmation, any sort of religious celebration, people would often, celebrate, and, there's a very ritualistic consumption of Mezcal, which is what you're seeing there with the fruit basket. The book doesn't explore this part of Mezcal as much. There's other people that have done that, looking at all the traditional context of Mezcal, and there's wonderful, especially Mexican scholars, and they're in the bibliography, or if you want to read more, you find it at the Day of the Dead, right? People take it to the cemetery, make offerings, but really for most of its history, and Mezcal's been around for hundreds of years. It was pretty much a drink that was made in a very localized context by people in their homes, right? This is a palenque, which is the local term for a distillery. I mean, very rustic kind of production, right? This is the Mixteca. People making it at home to either consume in their household, share with neighbors, or sell locally, right? In a local market. They would not have been shipping that container that she's filling to Houston, Texas for you guys to go take, drink down on 6th Street, right? It was a very, very different market. So what I set out to answer in the book is what were the conditions, both social and economic, that allowed for Mezcal's transformation into something that it's now consumed in places like this, right? So this is a bar in Las Vegas called Mama Rabbit, right? And it's, it's kind of it's a agave distillates concept bar essentially, right? And so, what I think is also interesting here, particularly about this bar, is that it's really fusing with those craft traditions that I was talking about earlier, right? They're obviously playing with the wood carvings, right? I mean, anybody here see that movie Coco? Do you remember? Right? It's that kind of, I would describe it, I think I call it in the book, the Oaxaca brand, right? Oaxaca's become a brand. We slap it on anything that, if you want to sell earrings, you want to sell something that's colorful and bright from Mexico, we call it Oaxaca, right? Whether or not it's from Oaxaca, we don't care. But I've seen all kinds of things marketed as Oaxaca, and what that stands for is that it's colorful, it's handmade, it's indigenous, it's always coded as indigenous, right? And I don't really have time to go into the complexities of indigeneity in Oaxaca here, but there's the assumption that if it's from Oaxaca, it's indigenous and it's artisanally produced, and that extends to kind of all of its crafts, not just wood carvings and Mezcal. I do think that a few notes of clarification are always necessary when I talk about Mezcal as a product. And the first one is we have to say what is actually Mezcal when we're talking about it, because that term gets used, but it's a little bit more of there's some complications to it. So when we say Mezcal, there's two ways that term's used, and the first is as a general umbrella term for any distilled spirit that's made from agave. So by that definition, tequila is a type of Mezcal, okay? So raicilla, if you had heard of raicilla, bacanora is a type of Mezcal, and those are all different regional alcohols. I'll talk about something called the denomination of origin in a second, but the important thing to remember here is that sometimes when people are using Mezcal, it could be referring to this whole family of agave distilled beverages. Tequila is probably the one that most U.S. consumers are familiar with, right? If you were a child, grew up in the 70s, your mom probably drank a tequila sunrise. I mean, I don't know. Actually, my mom did. I had a friend's mom. Now I realize she was an alcoholic, but yes, right? That she would, pour her tequila sunrise around 5 o'clock every night. This is the Espolón factory plant. And that's, you might have seen this as a really common tequila you can buy that, and I just include this picture up here so you can see the contrast in the facility, right? Remember the picture I showed previously here where, look at that little production site versus this production site, right? Tequila, generally speaking, is produced at a much higher volume, and it's produced with more industrialized, mechanized production, right? So these are big, you can kind of see in here, these are big autoclave ovens, right? And one of the defining features of tequila is that they steam the agave hearts, right? So people that complain about they don't like mezcal because it's smoky, that's why tequila is not smoky. It's because it's not cooked in an in-ground pit oven with firewood, so there's no smoke infusing it. That said, not all tequila, not all mezcal is smoky, because there's also facilities that produce mezcal like this that look much more industrial and are relying on different kinds of technology. Okay, the way I'm using mezcal in the book is its second definition, and this is more specific, and it's tied to something that's called a denomination of origin. Anybody heard of a DO before? Okay, so a denomination of origin in Europe, it's something called an AOC, and my French is non-existent, appellation de contrôle, something in French. It's why we have things like champagne that are tied to specific places and have a protected status, right? That they have to be produced under certain circumstances in a certain place. And this is tied to the French word of terroir. Anybody heard of terroir? Right? That things are place-based and their final characteristics are the product of both the physical and social environment in which they're produced. Okay, so mezcal, the second use of the term mezcal is referring to a specific drink that's produced according to a protected denomination of origin. This is the current denomination of origin standards for mezcal, right? It's 100% agave. And you'll notice there's some things, if you guys are tequila fans, there's some things that distinguish it from tequila. It's 100% agave. Tequila does not have to be 100% agave. I think it's like 51%, right? You can actually mix tequila. That's why you have this whole range of really good tequila to really bad tequila. That has all kinds of, artificial stuff or sugar or whatever. The other thing that is different between tequila and the mezcal I'm talking about in the book is that tequila has to be made from one type of agave, and this is key, I think, to understanding mezcal's popularity too, to some degree. Mezcal can be made from any number of agaves, okay? So it has this sort of infinite range of possibilities in terms of the plants that can be used, whereas tequila, it's one type of agave, it's blue agave, that you might have heard of, right? And there's the whole controversy and all kinds of interesting fraud and drama around, are they using blue agave and tequila? Are they have been doing tests and finding out, oh no, they've been adulterating with other agaves. It's a whole world that once you go down that rabbit hole, you'll never get out of it. Just to say a few things about denomination of origin, but I also think are important to why mezcal as a phenomenon happened when it did. So a denomination of origin, as I've said, is this geographical indicator that ties products to place and people. And it comes out of something that was called the Lisbon Agreement, and that was created in 1958. And it became a standard by which people could designate and then register and get sort of property rights, right, for specific products. And it's not limited to alcohol, right? There's all kinds of products. If you've ever gone to Central Market or Whole Foods, you can buy the special tomatoes that have the San Marzano, right? They have to be from a certain region in Italy. They have to be a certain variety of tomato. So we have this system in place, right? In Mexico, tequila gets a denomination of origin in 1974. It was the first DO in the Western Hemisphere. So tequila, right, has a DO 1974. Is it a coincidence that suddenly Americans are drinking tequila sunrises and margaritas? No, right? We suddenly have a regulatory framework, right? And a regulatory framework means that we can market it, right? We can say, here's this product, here's these standards, and a certain kind of value is created within its regulation. Mezcal gets a DO, but not until 1995. Okay, so almost 20 years later, right? We have a 20-year time span in which mezcal is just sitting there. People are making it, people are drinking it, but you guys don't know about it yet. Just for some added context, there's other denominations of origin in Mexico, and it's not limited to food products. We typically associate with food, but like Talavera pottery, which is a beautiful type of from Puebla, right? Lacquerware from Guerrero also has a denomination of origin. And there's probably, this might even not be up to date. They're always finding new ones. Amber from Chiapas, right? That has little insects in it. Those things all now have DOs, and we're seeing a proliferation of denomination of origin statuses for across not only Mexico, but other countries too. But Mexico in particular is really on the DO bandwagon. This is a map just showing where different types of alcohol are produced. Mezcal is usually associated with Oaxaca, which, depending on who you talk to, produces somewhere upwards of 90% of all mezcal in Mexico, but there's a lot of other places that produce mezcal. And so if you look at the lime green, those are all states of Mexico that have at least some region, or if not the whole state, where they have the denomination of origin and they can produce distilled alcohols and legally label them as mezcal. Okay. What do you notice about this map? Any observations about that, especially the lime green regions? Thinking about terroir and place and people. What would you observe about that?
The concentration of indigenous people, for instance?
Yeah, interestingly, right? So Oaxaca, the concentration of indigenous peoples are concentrated in the central southern Mexico. So you've got, it's interesting though, right? You've got a place, what's number 7 up there? Tamaulipas. Okay, right? You've got all this like sort of north central swath of the country. Mexico's a big country. It's geographically diverse. It's environmentally diverse, it's culturally diverse, right? If you're thinking about terroir as tied to place and calling it mezcal, does this really match a specific region? It doesn't, right? So this tells us that the DO, at least in Mexico, is very political, right? I think, I heard a story, I've never actually confirmed if it's true, that the Tamaulipas got the designation because there was a governor that was like with the pre, and there's like a whole, there's a pre-story behind it. Apologies to priestess, but, so it's, and every year like a new state is applying. So pretty soon, I think it's very likely that the whole country is going to have the DO, and it's going to be meaningless. Other than that, it's a Mexican product. But that brings into play, right now, we see lots of places in the United States. California right now is looking at agave and agave distillates as a new industry to replace all these things like almonds and avocados and things that they've grown that are very vulnerable to the changes coming with climate change. So can we have mezcal from California? People are making it. Can they call it mezcal? Not right now, right? It has to be called a destilado de agave. That's a fight that's starting to happen, right? So Mexico is going to have to try to figure out a way to protect its industry, and these DOs is one of those mechanisms, but is it going to be sufficient to, in the long term to really protect its agave distillates? I don't know. That's another book that I'm not going to write. Somebody, one of you will have to write that. Okay, I know I want to have time for some questions and comments. So my take on this was like what allowed, or what had to happen, that because the mezcal itself, the product itself didn't change, right? The stuff that I drank in 1995 out of a gasoline bottle was the same stuff that I drank out of a beautifully handcrafted, graphically gorgeous.
And very expensive.
That probably costs $200, right? The stuff inside the bottle didn't change, but something else had to change, right? And so what changed was the idea of the mezcal changed, right? The idea of the product changed and the value of that product changed, right? So I had to account for that, right? So there was a new economy that had developed around mezcal starting around 2010 and continuing to the present. And I have to thank my colleague Ted Fisher at Vanderbilt University. He and I talked and he said, you know, this sounds like an enrichment economy. I was like, ooh, enrichment economy. And this comes from a couple of sociologists that talk about sort of this post-industrial Western economies and how do we create value? How does capitalism create value in this sort of post, deindustrialized world? And he talks about things that he refers to as an enrichment economy that allow the wealthiest sectors of society, so elites in whatever society, to come in and they discover, and that's a word that's often used in conjunction with, he discovered mezcal, right? They discover these things, right? People always knew they were there. It's like sort of like America, right? We knew it was there, the people were there, but somebody discovered it and then appropriated it, right? And that's kind of what happened with mezcal, is that, rather than creating something new, right, is you create a new story about it. And that's exactly what happened here. Boltanski and Esquerre actually say, when they talk about the things that are most vulnerable to being enriched, they talk about fine arts, luxury goods. Specifically, I think this is interesting, the creation of national patrimonies, heritage sites, and appellation contrôlée regimes, right? And mezcal specifically fits into many of those categories now, right? It's a luxury good, it's a heritage product, it's got a denomination of origin, which is that appellation right there. It's part of the national patrimony of Mexico. It's like a textbook case of an enrichment economy. And how you create the value is, again, the story that you decide to tell about it. And so this is where we are here. This is where we end up. I love this image. I love and hate this image. Because, we've got this place that, back in the 90s, if I'd been walking, in Oaxaca, you'd walk past a place like this and you would keep on walking because there would be no reason for you to go in it. But now we've got a super skinny model posing in front of it with the chicken photobombing it. And so I'm trying to figure out, how does she get there, right? Like, how do we get to this point? What's the story that we had to tell in order to get the Vogue model in front of the mezcal expendio, right? And by the way, a few years ago when they did Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week, is this big global fashion event. They staged it in Oaxaca, and they actually did part of it out in agave fields. They put out like runways, and they had these, models just trotting through these villages in these big agave. So I mean, Vogue really has been a supporter of mezcal. And so for all this to happen, the enrichment narrative of mezcal is the same enrichment narrative that has been told about Oaxaca. Right, that it's a traditional place, that it's indigenous, right? It's where you go, and there's a lot of spirituality ascribed to indigenous peoples, which is not unique to Mexico or Oaxaca. It also happens in the part of I live in the Southwest, right? And the romanticization of indigenous peoples is high, and it drives a whole market economy around tourism, native jewelry, all these things, right? And this is where my interest in craft comes in, is that mezcal finally is branded as a craft product. Nobody talked about mezcal as craft until the boom, right? Nobody ever said, producto artesanal, right? So it wasn't an artisanal drink until somebody decided to call it an artisanal drink. This is a guy that I met. He's holding an original bottle. There was a guy, there's sort of a origin story, as there are with many things, about mezcal. There was a guy named Ron Cooper, who's an artist who lives in Taos, New Mexico, and he's got a he's got a book you can buy. It's his whole story. He's a character, and he's very polarizing in the mezcal world. But the story goes, he's an artist. He drives down and has this personal voyage of discovery. Again, the word discovery is used, and he tries this magical elixir. He calls it an elixir called mezcal. He decides, I got to bring this back to people in the United States. So 1995. Guess what? Ron Cooper's got his van packed with mezcal, and he's driving across the border, and they confiscate it. But he brings allegedly the first mezcal, artisanal mezcal, to the U.S. market. And this was one of his first producers, and this was the bottle where it's weird because he came out and he was wearing the exact same outfit that he's wearing on the bottle. This is from like 1995, 96. And I'm like, he looks identical. He's like frozen in time. So I'm actually with Ron Cooper, right, in this context here. And he's showing us this bottle, like he's like, I was the first artisanal mezcal in the U.S. And Ron Cooper has this brand called Del Maguey. If you are a mezcal person, you've probably seen a big, pretty green bottle with a beautiful colored hand-drawn label that is artistically produced. So he brings the first craft artisanal market. He brands it as, his brand is trademarked as Single Village Mezcal. Right? What does Single Village Mezcal sound like? Can you think of another expression?
Denomination of origin.
It's that. Is there another drink that has something?
Single malt scotch.
Yes.
Oh.
Single malt scotch. Right? Because think about it. The Scotch is tied to one place. It's smoky. Right? So he starts creating a framework for. He's one of the first people that starts talking about mezcal as having a terroir, which he translates to terruño in Spanish. I mean, have you ever heard Mexicans talking about terruño? They do now.
What is terruño?
It means terroir. It's like the taste of place, essentially. So it's like of the earth, of the place. And I'd never, in 30 years, heard Mexicans talking about terruño, but they do now, right? So this whole phenomenon introduces this framework for connoisseurship that didn't exist in Mexico, and it didn't exist in the US or other places yet. So he really is one of the people that establishes the framework for mezcal's enrichment back in the 90s. Okay, and remember, it's got its denomination origin in what year? 95, right? Just when Ron Cooper happens to be passing through Oaxaca in his van, right, to take it all back to you. I know we're going to run out of time here, and I want to save some time for questions. But the book also, I have, I kind of explore different aspects of this enrichment. One chapter is really about how gender plays into this. I never set out to talk about gender, but it became the elephant in the room. Going to all these palenques, and I kept seeing all these women, but nobody ever said they're mezcal producers, right? And I'm like, they're sure doing a lot of the work that I'm seeing around here. But it's like a lot of things, right? That women's labor as part of a household gets subsumed, and it just kind of gets anonymized, right? In a way that this figure of the maestro mezcalero, the master mezcal maker, is always a dude, right? And the older and the blinder and the more like decrepit, the better, right? When you go to visit that person, you want to see this like crusty old guy like wander out, because it's part of the performative aspects of creating the value, right? You want somebody that is assumed to have this long-standing communal native expertise, right? So it's about expertise. But I also started to hear about a few women that were rising as female producers, and so I set out to kind of get to know them and tell a little bit about what I thought was going on with gender. And I think it's complicated. I think that there's a big part of the industry is they have to downplay women's participation in the mezcal to highlight the few, right, to create value around these few women, right? It's like capitalism's doing some pretty tricky stuff, right, to create value. It has to ignore all the work that really women do, and then highlight a few to create value around those specific brands. I'll leave it there because I don't have isn't that much time. And then I wanted to talk about migration as well in the book, because migration, every time something happens in Oaxaca, because Oaxaca is one of the poorest states in Mexico, it has very little industry, and the state economy really runs on tourism, remittances from migrants that have gone to other places, oil in the isthmus, right? Pemex has refineries down there, and agricultural exports, right? I mean, more money comes from mangoes than, how many factories, right? So anytime there's something like this happens, the government economic sector is always like, oh, this is going to be, the thing we're going to save Oaxaca, we're going to make all this money, right? And a lot of people, I think the situation may be different now with some of the changes regarding immigration and especially to the United States, but the thing that everybody wanted to know when I was doing my research is, are people coming back to work in Mezcal? And I kind of, everybody was very optimistic, like, oh, everybody's gonna come home and start a Mezcal business. I'm like, well, I mean, maybe, but I don't think that's actually what's happening. And so what I found is, like many things in terms of development, it's uneven, right? Development's usually an uneven process, and Mezcal was no exception. I'm gonna end here because I think this is where Oaxaca is, and I think a lot of places right now that are becoming food and art destinations. I always think of Oaxaca as, I live down the road from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I said this for like 30 years and nobody ever listened to me. I said, Oaxaca's gonna be just like Santa Fe, you watch. And it is, right? It is this place, it is one of the most expensive cities in Mexico, in one of the poorest states in Mexico, just like Santa Fe, right? New Mexico is an incredibly poor place with a couple pockets of extreme wealth. It's built around an art economy, right? It's a food destination. It has indigenous peoples that people go to buy their, beautiful textiles and jewelry. Same thing is happening in Oaxaca, right? And every year I go back, there's more and more pushback from local people, right? That Oaxaca's not, I hear it again and again, Oaxaca ya no es para Oaxaqueños, right? Oaxaca's no longer for Oaxacans. I'd say that's been the last 10 or 15 years. But this was a cartoon that came out in the paper, right? It's a local guy that does cartoons for one of the El Imparcial, which everybody jokes is the Parcial because it's anything but imparcial. Right, and this is sort of encapsulates all of this process of the inversion of Mezcal's value. Right? So I'll end there, and I think we have some time for comments and questions.
Well, first, thank you to Lilas for this invitation, the opportunity to read this wonderful book. I wrote up some formal comments, and then just a couple of questions to kick off the discussion, and all of you can hopefully jump in as well. So this illuminating, and if I'm not being too corny, spirited study of the Mezcal trade concludes understatedly with the following phrase, quote, "It is this book's modest goal to introduce the human into the abstract principles of competitive advantage that underpin the new global economy," end quote. Actually, it's not a very modest goal at all to meld analytically the realms of subjectivity, meaning-making, and ontology that are at the core of human experience with the materiality of political economy and social structure that constrain and shape it. And it's even harder to pull it off successfully, as Ronda has done. Thanks to her sharp ethnographic eye and her narrative dexterity, it's a very enjoyable read as well. And her ability to distill very complex concepts and theories for the reader. Through her analytical intertwining of the value of meaning in the making of Mezcal as a global commodity, with the meaning of value in delineating the economic contours and social implications of the trade for the varied and scattered actors who sustain it. Ronda narrates the social life of Mezcal, its transformation from a popular alcoholic beverage, once stigmatized in Mexico for its indigenous origins and its associations with poverty, drunkenness, and the backwardness of Oaxaca, as that last slide showed, to its valuation by a far and largely US sophisticated hipster foodie consumer base as a craft alcohol. This artisanal liquid, which Ronda at one point in the book comparing mezcal's popularization to that of Oaxacan art, cleverly refers to as a type of liquid artisanry or something
Folk
like
art,
that.
yeah. They call it liquid folk art, yeah.
Embodies the supposed simplicity, purity, and authenticity of rural southern Mexico. But its reinvention, she painstakingly shows throughout the book, is better understood as the product of standardization imposed by the Mexican government and these international regulatory bodies on mezcal production and branding, very clever marketing strategies, consumer fantasy, disaffection with industrial food systems, and virtue signaling through ethical consumerism, or supposed ethical consumerism, and the growth of Oaxacan tourism and culinary tourism specifically, due to greater integration of that state into the national and international economy. In the finest tradition of commodity studies and food anthropology, she demonstrates how an everyday object can mediate and reveal, this was her terminology, complex global relationships. The mezcal consumed in trendy bars in New York or even Mexico City, I gather at this point, is not only produced by workers in the field and the distilleries of Oaxaca, but fundamentally through the attribution of value by consumers. The significance of objects, or discourse for that matter, is never unilaterally determined by their originators, but rather co-constituted by their consumers through process of cultural exchange and translation. As the result of social processes shaped fundamentally by relationships of power, the attribution of distinction, which is central to the maintenance of identities, whether personal or regional or national, presents a particularly intriguing topic for historical anthropological study when such significations, or more accurately, re-significations, are the product of complex, cross-cultural, cross-class, or cross-national exchanges that defy the tropes of organicism, traditionalism, and essentialism that are often conjured to explain them. That's a really long sentence. In many ways, mezcal's history, illustrative of the dignification by outsiders of an item of popular/ethnic culture once reviled by Eurocentric elites, is a familiar story to Latin Americanists. The crowning in official histories and the media and cultural industries of popular musical forms such as samba, merengue, son, bachata, tango as the embodiment of a national identity or soul has been toppled relentlessly by revisionist scholars who have shone light on the more complex and messy processes of foreign validation, political opportunism, economic profit-seeking, and popular contestation or negotiation that went into the making or the remaking of these forms. Yet notwithstanding, or perhaps because of such entangled processes or the limits of conventional storytelling, one of the labels most consistently affixed to culinary, artistic, or sartorial forms originating among poorer populations or regions that become commodified or nationalized or globalized is that of authenticity. Each history of this type, or perhaps better stated, each invented tradition of this type, of course, has its own specificities. So I think I was asked to come because of my work on Guaraná, and there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences, and in fact, I think, the story that you tell is much more akin to what Julia Sarrial traces in terms of yerba mate's reinvention. And for Brazil, I think it would be closer to acai, actually, where there are a lot of commonalities. It's something that gets discovered outside of its Amazon region, in the urban areas of Brazil in the south, and then it makes its way to the United States and Europe, largely through, I think, very clever business people who were involved in its marketing as an exotic superfood. So in my book on the history of Guaraná, the world's most caffeinated plant, it also revolves, however, around many of the same cultural axes that were present, or more actually presented, in the historical rollout of Mezcal, a beverage with strong, albeit very different psychoactive qualities, which actually makes a big difference in how they're categorized. So the physical quality is really important to this story, right? That derives from a native plant originating with an indigenous population in a backwater region and largely consumed for centuries in that region or adjacent regions, is transformed by manufacturers, advertisers, and urban consumers into a chic, fashionable beverage through historical processes that both reflected and reinforced broader and uneven changes in late developing capitalist nations. That said, the features, the forces, the trajectories, and the periodization relevant to the rise of the respective beverages differ in the books. Hence, the mezcal becomes valued as an artisanal, handmade craft, evocative of simpler rural lifestyles and niche status among foreign consumers and hipster tourists, Whereas Guaraná, as it's best known and widely consumed form as a soda, there is a very analogous story if we're looking at like sort of the artisanal production of Guaraná and how it makes its way into like alternative food markets, fair trade markets. But that's not really the dominant way in which it's known in mass society. Guaraná is a mass-produced industrial beverage that has been made to embody and fuel, like literally, the mobility, self-gratification, and high energy of modern life. But an interrogation of the claims and value of authenticity in many ways lies at the heart of both books, I think. If Clifford Geertz, in a very spidery metaphor, notably conceived of culture suspending humans in webs of significance that they themselves have spun, we might say that both books take a swat at those spider webs in the name of clearing the entryway, bad metaphors, to a more clear-eyed vision of the past and present, or more cynically, that both works aspire to a type of authentication of the non-authentic, the disenchantment of the enchanted. So I'd like to end my brief overview and kick off our discussion by asking you to reflect on authenticity as a conceptual analytical category. Why are you drawn to the set of questions about authenticity? How did you go about identifying its ascription or self-ascription? Have articulations of authenticity differed within Oaxaca by class, gender, or ethnicity? And a sort of provocative question, what might have been other possibilities or options for marketing this alcoholic upstart, given how it has to enter into a very established beverage and alcoholic consumer culture?
Okay, wow, that's a lot.
You guys are just wandering time.
Well, I think, authenticity, right, is, gosh, I'm looking at Polly back there because I think probably the first time I started thinking about that was working with Polly was on my dissertation committee, and probably the person that introduced me to the whole world of thinking about authenticity and I still remember we took a class on museum representation, right, and so these were just, we were reading and thinking about this, and this is, I think, I wonder now, I've been complaining a lot about my Gen Z students. Is this concept of authenticity, are people so cynical and disillusioned with the idea that there's anything such as authenticity in this world we live in, right? Everything's mediated by social media, right? But at the same time, we're always still trying to wade through all the morass of garbage, because we still think, I think all of us deep down inside believe there's still there's authentic experiences to be had somewhere, right? And if we can just sort of find it, then we get to have that pleasure of consuming it. And tourism is built in some ways. There's the extreme exceptions, like people who don't go to Las Vegas to experience the authentic Paris at the hotel that has the Eiffel Tower, but I still think people travel to places like Oaxaca because they think that is the authentic Mexico, right? If I had a dime for every time somebody said, I've been to the border but I haven't been to Mexico, I cringe when people say that, right? Because they're like, well, it's not really Mexico. I'm like, I don't know, I've talked to somebody from Chihuahua, I think they think it's Mexico. But this idea that culture and authenticity resides in certain places, and Oaxaca's become that place. What's interesting, I think, happening in Mexico is, and I think this goes hand in hand with why now Mexicans are discovering Mezcal and, calling it, this is one of our national beverages, is that the idea of what it means to be Mexican, what does it mean to be authentically Mexican is shifting. And I think in the 70s, Jalisco and tequila and mariachi and charreadas and all that kind of cowboy, kind of culture, that was the epitome. If you look at the golden age of Mexican cinema, that was the kind of the idea of the authentic Mexican. We had this set of national symbols, and I think those symbols from the 90s on have really changed. And I think there is a neo-indigenismo, like a new indigenismo that's been happening in Mexico and has been exported, where now it's always been there, right, with mestizaje and this undercurrent of, Bonfil Batalla talks about it, right, the hidden Mexico, whatever, Mexico Profundo, the profound Mexico. But I think that profound Mexico has now been it's not deep and hidden anymore. I think it is the brand now. I think it's been excavated, and it is now where young people in Mexico City are building their identities around it in a way that a few generations ago people weren't. So Mexico is much more becoming authentically indigenous, and I think Mezcal is part of that story. I don't believe there's anything authentic, right? I think it's everything is just constantly there and changing. Yeah, do you want to say something? You're looking at me. You're like,
No, go ahead.
no, I think I thought you
No,
were going to say.
I was just fascinated by the question and the idea of authenticity in relation to tradition, and time, and the way we experience time. Because I think, I had a question first about the relationship between that nationalist generation, and there is this book by Susan Delper, the Vogue of Things Mexican, that is about that period, that it was not only about building the nation, but also having commodities,
Right.
having folk art as commodities.
In the 20s and 30s.
In the 20s
yeah.
and 30s, and you have, folkways where American anthropologists, particularly American anthropologists, were very involved in crafts that were going to be expanded, exported, etc. But I think what I feel in the way we consume tradition or authenticity, at least this is my perception, and I wanted to see what you think. Oaxaca now, is enjoyed by a generation of young tourists that think of time very differently. And the way of they drinking tequila or mezcal, in my opinion, and this is just an opinion, it's not about this is authentic traditionally because it's done with time in this very specific location, and it takes a lot of time to ferment it, but it's more because it's kind of like distinct or elitist.
Right.
And that thing makes it cool to be in Oaxaca, also because the way we work is differently. So they can go and live in Oaxaca for 6 months, they can live in Mexico City for another 6 months, they can go to India and live for another 6 months. So it is the experience of these authenticities that they call them experiences, for kind of like you enjoy tastes, but you're never satisfied. It's the idea of modernity always changing, but this is accelerated these days. And this is what I think is different from that generation of the 20s, 30s, and then 40s that were actually looking for El México Profundo because, we didn't have it. But now I think they know that doesn't exist, but it's more of like a kind of like experience. That's the feeling I got in my last visit to Oaxaca.
Yeah, there's like
It
this
was-
time-space compression. It's interesting.
A very spicy, like Harvey used
Yeah, it's
to
like
say.
Harvey, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what your comments made me think.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting that there's so many digital nomads in
Yes,
Oaxaca.
yes.
People, and I'm like, how are they living? Like, what are they doing to make money? Like these, and they're from all over the world. They're
Yeah.
from Mexico City, but they're from Europe. They're from Korea. And you're right. I think they're there for a certain short time. They consume something and they move on to the next thing. They probably saw somebody on Instagram. I think we can't estimate the power of social media and the way that people are consuming ideas about places. The culinary culture moves so fast. Is mezcal already passé? Some people would say, yeah, now we've moved on to raicilla and sotol and whatever mezcal, that's so 10 years ago, right? The trends move really quickly. So I think maybe what it means to be authentic, though, is like you're saying, it's like this very fast-paced, living in the moment, consuming one trend after another. That is an authentic experience to them, right? Maybe they're not after, the traditionality of the drink. It's just there's this loose association with this place that is marketed as, special and valuable and elitist. I think elitist definitely fits in there. Oaxaca's not, I think of Mexico as having different kind of types of tourism, right? There's beach tourism, there's the lowbrow tourism, and Oaxaca took the path of being highbrow tourism and highbrow development. Yeah.
So in terms of food sovereignty, I wonder if you have conversations with local people about perceptions of the government and being able to protect the locality against foreign influence, or do you see any difference? Are they more excited Claudia and Bamboo do something that other governments didn't do? Do you see that perception?
I think people on the ground, I mean, the last few years to me have felt like, well, I guess, I don't know what it's like now. I have to say that, I mean, this research, it's almost like a historical study now. I think it ended in 2018 and a lot's changed on the ground, but I think what you see happening are the usual kinds of things. I mean, when I was doing this research, it felt sort of like a Wild West. Like, there was a lot of speculation over land. I mean, registering brand names for brands that didn't even exist, like like it was like the gold rush. Right? There's actually a book called The Mezcal Rush that a journalist wrote, because like people rushed in to stake a claim on this place. And now we're seeing the changes where, if you go to Oaxaca City, you drive on the freeway heading towards the isthmus, right, Carretera, that's all planted with agave now. It used to not be. So people are planting agave. They are, anticipating, a market 10 years in advance. The government, I mean, Oaxacan government's not known for being, I guess it should be known for being corrupt, right? It is, one of the things with the Oaxaca government is that it tends to be a place where you get these elected officials that are seen as from moneyed families that may or may not even live in Oaxaca, right? That come in and they, with their new plan, their infrastructure plans, right? They build highways that are never finished, and that's, and some of the development around of the mezcal industry in the time that I was doing this research was, redoing, I talk about this, they developed a ruta de mezcal, like a mezcal route. They have all these tourist routes. They have one for mole, they have one for different kinds of handicrafts, right? And the question, I talked to the people in the state government, and they're like, oh, we just have to make another route. They told us, like, and whether it's going to actually bring any real material benefits to communities, that's kind of always a secondary thing, right? So I think the nature of politics in a state that is very poor, they had an incentive program when I was doing this research to give these, they called them kits, and that's how they would say it in Spanish, kit un kit. That, like if you wanted to produce mezcal, they would provide you with, certain kinds of equipment. Like, we're gonna give you 3 stainless steel fermentation vats. We're gonna give you, lonja to put over your, like a tarp, right, to put over your, they had this whole little kit that they would give people, and it's like, is that really gonna promote like sustainable, scalable mezcal production? Probably not, right? So I think a lot of the stuff that the government put money into, I don't think they actually, there's not a lot of follow through it, because the administration's changed and all those people are gone, and then they bring in new people.
There is also the problem of land tenure in the whole of Mexico, but
Yeah.
particularly in Oaxaca, because there were many of that land were ejidal, right? They were communal land, kind of like supervised by the state, and then it got privatized in a very unlawful way or irregular way with bribes or things like that,
Yeah.
and then the ejida, like the leaders of some ejido communities tend to be very corrupt, and they were called rentistas because they would rent out the land. So I think it's a very complex issue, the land tenure issue.
Yeah, the
in
land tenure,
Oaxaca.
and Oaxaca has the most municipalities of any state in Mexico. So if you
Yeah.
look at the map of the way that Oaxaca's parsed out, it's just like these tiny, like it's just this patchwork of different municipalities, and each one is tied to, like you said, oftentimes they have ejido lands that are communally held. Some are sold, some are rented out. There's a lot of land speculation. There's also, I didn't even really talk about it in this talk, but there's the whole cultivated agave versus wild agave. So so people farm agave, but then a lot of the what I would say the prestige mezcals, if you will, are made from wild agaves, right? So these are agaves that people go out and find in whatever, on a hillside that's just wildly growing there. And some of these plants, some of the varietals, so espadín is the most commonly used mezcal variety. It's the most commonly farmed agave. That takes about 6 to 8 years to mature before you can use it. But a lot of the wild varieties that are just growing in, you know, sometimes they're on they're communally held lands, but people will go on and like poach them, and some of those agaves take up to 15, 16 years to mature before they can be used to produce mezcal. So, you know, and these are not renewable plants, right? So once you cut them, that's it. So, you know, there's agave poaching. People, when I was working with illegal, although I don't talk about that in the book, that one morning I was at the distillery, we got a call that come out the field now. The crew had gone out, and they had somebody come in the middle of the night and just like stole a bunch of, like they had cut down half this field of agave, right?
Wow.
So that happened, things like that happen all the time, right? There's poaching, there's, you know, there's a lot of, there's a dark underbelly of the mezcal industry that, you know, and there's other things I don't talk about in the book. You know, some of these communities also they're involved in the drug trade, which I was very careful not to go into too much. Some of the main communities also are cartel communities, right? There's cartel presences, and some of the people that started one of the biggest commercial brands, who I do mention his name, I don't say this, but he got started as a drug dealer. He was marijuana, one of the biggest marijuana producers in the Valley of Oaxaca, right? So then, you know, became a big time mezcal guy, who was later murdered. So there's all these other kinds of things that are, these other dynamics, right, around land and the economy, both licit and illicit, that it's hard to parse out what piece of it that mezcal is actually playing, I think, to your question.
Any other question?
Oh, what's going to be what selection are we going to have tonight? Just gonna be really down. I sort of got my top 10 list here of mezcal.
You know, okay, so.
And actually, Illegal is number 12 on this listing.
Oh, really? Yeah,
Yes.
so.
But it said it gave good reviews, taste and all, but
Well, I mean.
however, I don't know if it's a ranking.
I don't know. Illegal. I will put a plug for it. I didn't make. It's probably not the mezcal that my hands. I mean, so that's an interesting thing. If people knew that there was this like gringa back there making their mezcal, like I mean, I helped. I was back there chopping agave. It was like, you know, I worked in a distillery as part of my research for this. Would it be an authentic mezcal if they knew that my hands were the ones?
Well, what are sort of legally? What are the sort of the, you know, is it just a certain plant in the distilling process, or what? So what makes it just, you know, legally on a legal basis mezcal?
Well, okay, that's a great question,
What are factors?
actually. And that, I didn't talk about it here. I touch on it in the book. So a few years ago, I think it was 2017, right? So there's the category of mezcal, right? So there's this sort of general standard for the denomination of origin. 2017, they modified the denomination of origin to create 3 different subcategories of mezcal. One is called simply mezcal, the other is artisanal, or artisanal mezcal, and the other is ancestral mezcal. And that was a huge controversy fight in the mezcal world.
And those are based on what? The plant or distilling or
Distilling
flavors or what?
Kind of all of the above, but particularly the aspects of its production, the type of crushing, how you crush your agave. So a few years ago, particularly when they gave out those kits I was talking about a few years ago, they started handing out these mechanical shredders that are essentially wood chippers, right? You can feed so to make your mash to ferment for mezcal, you have to break down the agave, and then you let it ferment in some sort of, you know, receptacle. Oftentimes it's an oak barrel, repurposed wine barrel. I saw somebody fermenting in an old wash tub basin one time. It was like just made of enamel, right? You can ferment in animal skin, whatever.
Hope it had been washed.
So, you know, but you've got to crush down your agave, right? So how you crush down your agave matters, which sort of designation you get. If you put in a wood chipper, that's mechanical. You might have seen pictures of a horse hooked up to a giant wheel called a tajona, right? That crushes the agave. That's another way you can crush agave. If you want to label your mezcal as ancestral, you must crush it by hand using a mallet. In this technique called a maso y canoa, a mallet and a canoe, because it's this pit, kind of a hole in the ground that you pound. You have guys literally with a mallet, right? So that is one aspect of getting a certain type of designation. If you distill in a clay pot versus a copper still, that distinguishes whether your mezcal can be called ancestral or artisanal. My question is, I think the terms themselves are somewhat arbitrary. What does ancestral mean?
Well, real quick, so is that set up by like an association of mezcal producers, or is that by the government, or who?
Yeah, the government. Yeah, in conjunction with there's a regulatory agency. It's called Comercam. The acronym changes. It's changed a few times. It keeps going back and forth. And they are the regulatory commission that oversees certification of mezcal. And you can go to their page. They have a pretty significant website. Yeah.
I have a question for you, T-Press, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What caught your attention when you saw this manuscript? What told you, oh yeah, this is way beyond academic audiences?
Well, unlike Rhonda, I really do love mezcal.
We should do the tasting.
And my wife's a restaurant chef, so like I've been kind of fairly closely tied to culinary topics for most of my adult life. And I don't know, I think I got into mezcal probably around 2000, 2001 on a trip to Mexico. And so I could see the boom coming even before sort of 2010. And I also think, I've been sort of thinking about this during the talk too, is that I do think there is something to the fact that like, the craft commodity of it is certainly created. But as someone who likes and appreciates mezcal had all the goods. Like it truly is an extraordinary beverage when made well. I had another mezcal project that was under contract, and the author was very late on it, and in order to buy himself an extension on his deadline, he sent me mezcal. He sent me 6 small bottles, and each one was from a different type of agave. It tasted like versus a Tobala versus a Papalote and these stuff, and it's extraordinary.
And he got an extension?
And he is and so I think there is something to the fact that it is an extraordinary beverage that takes years and years to produce, that does involve a lot of technical skill, regardless of who's doing it or whether there's crushing it in a canoe or with a wood chipper. And the end product, for some people at least, delivers a lot of pleasure. People love this stuff, and personally I understand why. And so I think it is a little bit different than some other kinds of craft commodities, whether they're consumables like mezcal or food or handicrafts or something. I don't know exactly what the pleasure principle is in this equation, but I feel like it's there on some level. And anyway, so that's part of why I knew that a book about mezcal would have an audience, because people like things that give them pleasure, even reading about them.
Is there still worms in the stone?
There is a question.
In some of it, yeah.
In some, yeah.
Yeah, so I
That's
was
a-
gonna ask about the worms.
That's sort of a gimmick, or
Yeah.
what,
All right,
yeah.
It's a gimmick, but isn't it associated with a notion of exoticism
Well,
Right.
so
Authenticity, right?
and
Well,
authenticity?
well, I think
So
people,
it's not a
I think the worm thing is really misunderstood. So
It's a lark.
Yes, mezcal.
How
Okay,
about Scorpios too?
the scorpion. Well, scorpion's a
Serpent.
marketing thing by Douglas French, who created Escorpion Mezcal. He's a very interesting guy. And I can't actually tell that the scorpion tastes like scorpion. I haven't seen chapulines in it. But the worm is, think of it as a flavored mezcal, right? So the worm is a little worm that you can find on the agave plant, right? And people locally like the flavor of that worm, and people eat them. You can buy them in the market. So yeah, the salt has the worm in it. It has its own flavor, and mezcal de gusano is, think about it as like a cured mezcal, like it's like a flavored mezcal. So some of it you can buy that has and it has a taste that gives it, right? Just like if you put a fruit in it, right, and it had a certain flavor. There's mezcal de pechuga, which is when they do a breast. Oftentimes, so when they distill, this is something that they would make. They make holidays, weddings, but you also can buy it too, right? And then when they distill, they put a bag, like a cheesecloth bag, that will have some sort of a protein, usually a chicken or turkey breast, some combination of fruits and spices. So they might put nanche or cherry, whatever fruit they want, right? Depending on the distiller, they might put clove, they might put cinnamon in it. I've seen allspice, pimienta gorda, and it creates a flavor profile, right? So the worm is, think of it like that, like it's just another flavor of mezcal. And then for whatever reason, when the marketing, right, is that, there's all these stories like it's to get you drunk, it's to make you hallucinate, it's to prove it. I've heard that it shows the freshness of the bottle of mezcal because the worm's either entero or it's disintegrated, which doesn't, I don't know if that's true. I mean, so there's this proliferation of storytelling around it. Yeah, but I think of it as, it's just another flavor of mezcal. It's like a flavored, So that's the worm.
I just wanted to interject, I think, I don't know if this goes along with the discussion, but there's a good book on the economics and really sort of history of the two spirits, tequila and mezcal. It's called Divided Spirits.
Oh yeah, Sarah Bowen.
Sarah Bowen wrote it.
Yeah, she's a friend of
I think it's very good at contrasting the two spirits.
She does a really good job breaking down the denomination of origin. She really good. That's kind of the focus of it. And her argument is, ostensibly these denominations of origin should be protecting the spirits, but she kind of argues that ultimately they don't, right? That it's more complicated, and that these regulatory frameworks don't always do what in principle we think that they're doing. So it's a great book.
Yeah, it is. Maybe one other thing about DOs is, I guess more locally or Texas, is Daisy Lyrian or Sotol. So plenty of Daisy Lyrian grows in West Texas.
Yeah.
In fact, I've harvested Daisy Lyrian in Blanco.
I mean, it's used all over Albuquerque. It's a landscaping plant, right? I'm like, God, somebody just go down and chop down everybody's yard.
So yeah, there's some guys in Dripping Springs that started a business of making Texas Sotol.
Texas what?
Sotol. It's an agave adjacent spirit.
Yeah.
It's not made from agave actually. But anyway, it has been interesting watching that sort of from the sidelines of how this violates the DO.